Welcome to the other side of Letby. In episode 70, we're going to do a little bit of science, the purpose of which is to prove that what Dr. Jayaram said he saw, the pink-flitting rash, is not actually possible, given that they used the constraints and descriptions of the Lane-Tanswell paper to describe how this pink-flitting rash actually came about. And we'll have a look at what science says about the possibility of Dr. Jayaram and Dr. Harkness witnessing the same thing. One big porky told by Dr. Bowen during her evidence that has a very big impact on this. And a quick look at the pseudoscience of what I call Evans syndrome. So Evans syndrome, to give it its proper medical name, is intentional aerogenic assault syndrome, or IAAS for short, IAAS syndrome, otherwise known as Evans syndrome. So the diagnostic criteria for Evans syndrome is 1, a preterm infant with a central venous line or on mechanical ventilation and who has CPR or all three. 2, suddenly collapses and is unresponsive to resuscitation. There are no post-mortem findings of an air embolism, no image findings of an air embolism, and all of the technical matters in relation to the ventilation, the lines, etc., are ruled out in favour of a nurse intentionally injecting air into a central venous line based on the really solid evidence of a completely recalled finding of a pink-flitting rash and the presence of a nurse, or I saw somebody holding a syringe near the central venous line 2 years ago. But critical to the diagnostic criteria, I didn't record anything like that at the time. So let's look at all these logical fallacies that make up Evans syndrome and why it is indeed pseudoscience. So we have the conflation of the absence of evidence with evidence of malice or intent. And the logical fallacy here is argumentum ad ignorantium, or absence of evidence is evidence of crime. And the basis of this is that the failure to detect air embolism in any way, shape or form is again proof of the administration of an air embolism, when the truth is that the true finding of a vascular air embolism requires positive evidence from gas chromatography of intravascular air or surveillance footage of malpractice. In other words, video camera capture or witnesses seeing the actual act. And then we have the retrospective testimony as proof when we know that human memory after 2 years in particular is completely unreliable and highly suggestible. And we have confirmation bias of the staff assuming guilt after poor outcomes. Now, in normal circumstances, eyewitness testimony, or even worse, the lack of eyewitness testimony, unsupported by contemporaneous records, is deemed inadmissible in court due to the high error rate. And there was a recent case in 2024 that highlights this, and I'll leave a link to that. Now, the main component of pseudoscience is that it cannot be falsified, and that's the reason why it was so difficult to defend this case, no matter what people say about Ben Myers and the circumstances of the case. If you're forced to argue against a pseudoscientific premise, it's virtually impossible, which again is the point of pseudoscience. So, for example, the construct can't be falsified on the basis of no error was found on the autopsy because it dissolved in the meantime, or there was no footage or witness because the perpetrator hid it. And this violates what's known as Hitchens' razor, which is a cousin of Occam's razor. And Hitchens' razor states that what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. But there must be a willingness to do that, mustn't there? So we have here a series of circular logic extraction, like a machine, really. The circular logical extraction machine. Premise: we excluded central venous lines, ventilators, and CPR, so it must be intentional. Therefore, the only cause of the presence of a venous air embolism, which we can't prove, is the intentional administration of air. And this is known again as self-sealing logic. The lack of an alternative cause proves the unproven case. And that is highlighted by the endless repetition of "it was skin discoloration, which I had never witnessed before." Absence of evidence provides proof of guilt. So the real-world harm of IAAS, or Evans syndrome, is that the false accusations risk scapegoating people like Letby, for instance, who are trying to explain preventable tragedies. And it obstructs a true discovery, which would come from the investigation, proper investigation of all novel pathologies, for example, channelopathies, which are a type of an airlet condition that cause heart irregularities, or metabolic disorders, which are turning up every week. So the scientific approach to causation would require direct evidence, so that would be air on imaging, in a distinct pattern as described by Dr. Owen Arthurs in the case of BBE, that the air must be present at the time of the X-ray, at the time of the incident, and no other finding of air provides a necessary standard of proof that air embolism occurred at all. So that's in the public record. In the case of BBE, look it up. But the IAS syndrome relies on blame narratives and exclusion. In real science, the intentional harm proof would require forensic evidence. In the pseudoscientific IAS, assumed intent is enough. And again, in the real world, accountability from peer-reviewed mortality reviews which did actually occur, including postmortems which found, in all cases where they were carried out, non-malfeasance and death by natural cause, replaced in IAS by unfalsifiable accusations. So Evans syndrome uses unfalsifiable accusations as opposed to gold standard postmortem findings. And the purpose of Evans syndrome is not to get to the bottom of a scientific problem. It's to provide a villain and pave the way for emotional catharsis for everyone else involved. Its purpose is also to create moral panic. So by creating a villain, we no longer have to deal with the complexities of the system and all the failings that were highlighted in the RC-PCH report, which are systemic failings throughout the NHS. The moral panic which that should cause to society is now bypassed. And another fundamental component of IAS, or Evans syndrome, is self-preservation. So proponents dismiss counter-arguments as we're covering up the truth, people like me, or we don't want to accept that Lucy Letby could be guilty. And this creates an infinite logic loop of the proof that no one injected air is the proof of my assertion that it didn't happen being flawed. So IAS, or intentional aerogenic assault syndrome, otherwise known as Evans syndrome, epitomizes pseudoscience. It is the very characteristic of pseudoscience because it replaces evidence with speculative blame, exploits well understood cognitive biases, mainly fundamental attribution error, which is the faulting of individuals over systemic failure, and that the syndrome thrives in an environment of evidentiary voids. Unfalsifiable claims are the main driver of the syndrome. And the reality is that in medicine, these frameworks risk devastating consequences, as we have seen for Lucy Letby and their families, and perpetuation of systematic abuse within the care system, and it causes a destruction of morale among staff and creates stagnation in understanding the true causes of neonatal collapse. And it's highly unethical, because ethical practice demands that we confront uncertainty with rigorous science, real science, and not invent diagnostic bogeymen. And one of the main diagnostic findings that prove Lucy Letby's guilt is the presence of this pink-flitting rash nicked from the Lane Tanswell paper by Dr. Jayaram and others. So now we'll move to the science bit. Now in the show notes I will leave a comprehensive document with all the references and the calculations and the workings out, so you don't have to worry about that. You can read it if you want, don't read it if you don't want. But it is subject to falsification, which means it is real science and not pseudoscience. And the first thing we have to do is create a timeline for events that we know from the public record. As I've always said, if you have the notes, that's the clinical records with all of the data points, blood gases, electrolytes, space access, if you had all that, this would be much easier, working out the pseudoscience from the science. But my argument is that you don't need it to know that at least this is pseudoscience. So we take the timeline. Letby comes on work at 8 p.m. on the 8th of June, and that's her first contact with baby A. And we're going to use baby A as the index case for IAS, or Evans syndrome, because it provides the blueprint for Evans syndrome. But you can pretty much apply the same logical process to every one of the cases. So Letby arrives 8 p.m. on the 8th of June 2015, and that's her first contact with baby A. Now, we know from the nurse unnamed that she said she entered the unit, and the swipe data shows that she entered the unit at 20:20, so 8:20 p.m., when cardiac resuscitation was well underway. And we know that the infusion started at 20:05 or 8:05. So if we give 5 minutes for tidying up and putting all the equipment away, etc., from 8:05 until the unnamed nurse's entry into the unit, when CPR is underway, we have a 10-minute gap from 8:10 to 20:08 or shorter, during which the collapse occurred. Now, Dr. Jayaram in the Thirlwell inquiry, and also contained in the Court of Appeal document, states that he arrived at 20:23. So there's a good 10 minutes between the collapse and the arrival of Dr. Jayaram. Dr. Harkness said in evidence that he removed the PICC line at 8:27 p.m. and that the baby's heart stopped critical. So the baby went into cardiac arrest at 8:33. So the baby goes into cardiac arrest 10 minutes after Dr. Jayaram arrives. According to the record in the trial, the Court of Appeal document, and the Thirlwell inquiry, there is a 10-minute gap between the baby initially collapsing due to supposedly an air embolism of 5 mils into the vein at some time between 8:10 and 8:15, leaving an 8 to 10 minute gap before he arrives, and a 25-minute gap before cardiac arrest. Now, Dr. Harkness also made it plain that there was no ECG changes in the baby at the time of the collapse, that the collapse was due to the cessation of breathing. And this is necessary to prove or to draw the mind away from the possibility that the PICC line was the source of the problem, on the assumption that no cardiac arrhythmia means that the PICC line hadn't migrated to come into contact with the tissues of the heart, which again, Dr. Harkness said in evidence in court that there was no evidence of then or since. Now, this is even though the PICC line was inserted and remained above the midline on the X-ray, which means radiographically anyway that it was not ideally placed, and we're conveniently forgetting the presence of the umbilical venous catheter that's been sitting there stagnating in a pool of blood with no infusion going into it for 7 hours at this point. And during the resuscitation, because the PICC line had been removed, the static and by now probably biofilm putrefied umbilical venous catheter was withdrawn to what's called the low position, so where it becomes usable, and it was infused during the resuscitation because there was no other point of venous access. So these are all critical forensic points. Now we're going to look at the two main scientific principles that would determine how the gases would move from an air embolism in the circulation. And those two physical or chemical laws are Henry's law and Fick's first law. So Henry's law basically says that the gases will move from one location to another in direct proportion to the difference of the pressure, partial pressure of the gas, from the higher concentrated area to the lower concentrated area. So in this case, we need to split the air embolism into two components, the oxygen component and the nitrogen component. And we have to remember that the non-expert Sally Kinsey wasn't able to answer the question about the difference between oxygen and nitrogen. When she was asked by Ben Myers to explain the difference, she said, "I can't answer that question," which is A-level biology or chemistry. So the gaseous components of the air embolism are oxygen, 21%, nitrogen basically makes up the rest of it. So that leaves us with 1.05 mils of oxygen in a 5 mil air embolism. That's what they claim, the spoonful of air. They claim that the embolism that Lucy Letby put directly into the right atrium through a central venous line contained 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, which means if we look at the oxygen component first, that's 1.05 mils of oxygen. Now, we also have to recall that there is a patent foramen ovale present in the baby. And the patent foramen ovale is simply a hole between the right atrium and the left atrium. And studies show that air or anything else rarely passes into the left-hand side because the pressure differential on the left-hand side is too high to allow it to happen. So that just simply means that when the right heart is beating, it's generating a lower pressure than when the left heart is beating, and they're both beating synchronously. So the pressure in general in millimeters of mercury on the left-hand side of the heart is always higher than on the right-hand side of the heart. So we find that even in the presence of a foramen ovale, it is unusual that any gas or embolism or anything else will pass through that from right to left. So we'll look at Henry's law in a moment. Now, Fick's law, F-I-C-K-S, governs the diffusion of gases like oxygen and nitrogen across a concentration gradient. So in the context of an air embolism, it explains how oxygen dissolves from the gas bubble into the bloodstream. Now, both Henry's law and Fick's law relate only to putting the oxygen into solution in the blood. So that's the same as chucking a spoonful of salt into a stream of water. We're not looking at what happens to that salt once it gets into the stream of water. So you can think of Henry's law as putting the spoonful of sugar into the tea, and Fick's law of stirring the spoonful of sugar into the tea. So they're both having an effect to distribute the oxygen into the general pool of the cup of tea, or in this case, the circulation. So a circulation of blood is not a parking lot. It's a highway, and there are no localized systemic effects. So let's run through the numbers here really quickly. As I say, there's a working out of all of this in the show notes. Now, Henry's law uses three components: the concentration of the dissolved oxygen in the blood, Henry's constant, which is a number that doesn't change because it's specific to the characteristics of blood, but would be different for a different medium, and the partial pressure of the oxygen in the embolism compared to the blood. Now we know that the partial pressure, which is simply a definition of the pressure provided by the oxygen separately and the nitrogen separately, because that's how Henry's law works. And that's why it's called partial pressure. So because there's more nitrogen in the embolism than there is in the blood, and because the pressure contained within the embolism is at atmospheric pressure or room pressure, the proportional difference between the pressure of oxygen and nitrogen within the air embolism is so much bigger than it is in the blood into which it's going. So for Henry's law, it would be at least 4 times higher, 160 millimeters of mercury in room air versus 40 millimeters of mercury of the tension or the pressure of oxygen in venous air. That's a 4-to-1 pressure advantage for the embolism, pushing air out of the embolism into the venous circulation. Now, Fick's law uses different components in its calculation. That's the diffusion flux, which is the movement of the oxygen measured in mils per second, the diffusion coefficient of oxygen in blood, so again that's a fixed number, the surface area of the bubble, and the boundary layer thickness between the bubble and the surrounding blood. So the 2 variables here are the surface area and the boundary. But the boundary area restriction is less than 0.01 centimeters in flowing blood. So that's the difference between the distance of the air in the embolism and its connection to the blood, 0.15 centimeters, which leaves us with the only variable in this formula that we don't know, and that's the surface area of the actual embolism itself. All of the other components of both Henry's law and Fick's law are fixed and predictable. So if we used Fick's law alone for a 5 mil air embolism, which is 1.05 mils of oxygen, and we know that the neonatal cardiac output is 200 mils per kilogram per minute in a healthy 1600 gram neonate, the total oxygen extraction from that into solution we can calculate as 16 mils of oxygen per minute. So the time to dissolve the 1.05 mils from the embolism from Fick's law would be 25 hours, which seems to indicate that the oxygen takes a very long time to get into solution. But when we add Henry's law to that and the massive pressure difference between the oxygen in the bubble compared to the oxygen in the veins, and combine them both together, and we're only talking about oxygen here now, we're not talking about nitrogen. The nitrogen would take much, much longer to dissipate into the blood. But by combining Fick's law and Henry's law together, we will get the disappearance of this oxygen into the general solution of the blood in less than 4 seconds. And we haven't taken into account the effect of hemoglobin on that oxygen as it arrives into the venous circulation. So the hemoglobin will take up that oxygen from solution in milliseconds. Now we have to consider as well that we're talking about a single bubble of air in the embolism, but we know that the heart rate continued, albeit at a slower rate, 60 beats per minute according to Dr. Harkness, and we know that CPR started. So that's going to break up the bigger bubble into many, many smaller micro bubbles. And that's been demonstrated in experiments time and time again. And what this has the effect of doing is increasing the surface area of exposure of the gases in the embolism to the pressure differences in the venous system, which, if anything, is only going to speed up the dissolution or disappearance of this oxygen into the general circulation. So if we took all of that and we applied the mathematics to it and the worst case scenario for Lucy Letby, we would see a disappearance of the oxygen from the air embolism completely into solution, disappeared into general solution, no longer capable of producing a localized effect within about 8 minutes max, but much, much more likely to be shorter than that. So from our timeline, we know that from the entrance of the embolism into the right side of the heart at between 8:10 and 8:15, and the arrival of Dr. Jayaram 8 minutes later, at least 95% of that oxygen is gone before he even gets there. Therefore, Dr. Jayaram cannot observe any localized effects of the oxygen in the air embolism at all, under any circumstances, because it's now in the general pool of oxygenated blood, which will produce systemic effects and not localized effects, the highway rather than the parking lot. Now, to make matters worse for Dr. Jayaram, he claims that he witnessed cutaneous or skin manifestations of this phenomena, but the skin only gets about 6% of the distribution of all blood from the heart. The bulk of it is going to go to the brain and to the heart itself. So between those two organs, we're talking about roughly 75% of the total cardiac output going to the brain and the heart, and only 6% going to the skin. So even if we didn't get any dissolution or disappearance or dissipation of the oxygen in the embolism, and all of that oxygen went to the skin, that's 1.05 mils, that wouldn't be visible. That amount of additional oxygen going to the skin, if that were the case, is not measurable by an oximeter, let alone the human eye. And remember, the Lane-Tanswell paper makes it plain that the pink-flitting rash was the result of direct oxygenation of hemoglobin adjacent to free air, which Jayaram clumsily tries to explain in his Thirlwell evidence. So what Jayaram doesn't realise is, because of Henry's law and Fick's law and physics and how it works, the oxygen from that embolism, in the worst case scenario, is gone by the time he reaches the room, and therefore cannot produce a pink-flitting rash. And even if all of it wasn't gone and went directly to the skin, it would go systemically to the skin, and there isn't enough oxygen to produce a localized effect on the skin. So the pink-flitting rash is something he made up 2.5 years later in a police interview and didn't record it at the time it supposedly happened. And the reason that he didn't record it at the time it supposedly happened is because it didn't happen. And the reason that it didn't happen is because of the physical characteristics of Fick's law, and in particular Henry's law, and the massive affinity for the uptake of oxygen by fetal hemoglobin. Therefore, Jayaram's claim of the magical pink-flitting rash is physically impossible and fulfills the criteria for pseudo-scientific evidence. And because it's recall evidence, and in fact reconstructed evidence, that was also influenced by canteen or dining room chatter, despite his sending of an email to Dr. Gibbs to suggest it in 2015, which again the Court of Appeal verified as some kind of support for Jayaram's theory, the physics doesn't add up. Now, anyone can run this stuff through any model they want, and they're going to get different outcomes depending on how fast the big bubble breaks up. But we have already determined that the heart continued to beat until 2033, 18 minutes or so after the collapse, and that CPR carried on for 40 minutes, I think, in total, breaking up the surface area of that embolism through the entire period that was happening. So you can take it to the bank. Dr. Jayaram's magical pink-flitting rash is an illogical construct, and any review of the evidence in the Letby case has to take into account the physics, the unavoidable physics and chemical behaviour of hemoglobin, the fact that air and oxygen in particular goes into solution into the entirety of the river, not just where you throw the spoonful of salt. They have to take all that into account and conclude that despite what Dr. Jayaram remembered about the pink-flitting rash, it couldn't have actually happened at all. And therefore it fits nicely into the entire pseudoscientific construct of evidence theory, otherwise known as intentional aerogenic assault syndrome. Then we add to that the irrational and nonsensical use of post-mortem x-rays without any reference to the time lag between the time of death and the time of autopsy, which overwhelmingly suggests that at a minimum these gas lines or these unusual gas lines in front of the spine are as a result of post-mortem changes, or at worst, the presence of two central lines in baby A and a central line in nearly every other baby. And the fact that we know, but it wasn't told to the jury, that 90% of babies who have CPR are left with findings of air embolism on CT scans following death, meaning that within the limited experiments that we have, CPR created 90% of all unusual lines of gas in front of the spine. But they were actually measured by CT scans, which are much more accurate and could place the things in a better 3D location. So all of this evidence is junk, absolute scientific junk, that it's not worthy of taking part in a criminal trial, where there are very plain rules about what can go into evidence and what can't go into evidence. So if whoever's job it was to do the due diligence on the evidence before it was admitted as a plausible scientific method by which to enter it into evidence, they failed miserably. And the Court of Appeal ruling that all of the evidence in the Letby trial was admissible is clearly wrong, because it's not admissible. Pseudoscience has no place in a court of law in the UK, and that is well established. Just because everyone was gullible enough to believe this story, biased enough to give this story credibility, doesn't mean that anyone has to believe this story. And it's particularly incumbent on judges who have the power of life and death effectively over the people in front of them to refuse to consider evidence that is pseudoscientific and not scientific. So the CCRC that's re-examining all the outrageous claims made by Darry Evans and backed up by these experts have to throw all of that evidence out, and making the excuse that it was possible for someone to argue that at the time, but because they didn't, Lucy Letby has to stay locked up for the rest of her life, makes a mockery of any pretense of the dispensation of justice. All they have to do is admit that the evidence should never have been admissible. Lucy Letby doesn't have to enter any new evidence into the Court of Appeal. Court of Appeal have to throw out the evidence that they've got because it's junk, and that should be sufficient to free her and exonerate her. Now let's look at the second scenario, whereby, because we know that there was a patent for Eamon O'Valley. So how does the patent for Eamon O'Valley complicate this situation? Well, it complicates it a lot, because it's almost certain that the extra pressure load created by a 5 mil air embolism would pass over into the left-hand side of the heart through a patent for Eamon O'Valley. Now, Professor Lee has stated that that wouldn't be the case. Well, he's implied that it wouldn't be the case. But that's largely based on the fact that he doesn't believe there was an air embolism there in the first place. In the normal run of events, without the massive pressure load into the right side of the heart by an air embolism, even in a preterm neonate, It's very unusual for anything to cross the patent frame ovale from right to left, which is called a shunt. It can happen, but it is actually surprisingly infrequent. And that's just because the pressure on the left-hand side acts like a stopper, and it also keeps the patent frame ovale small. It doesn't allow it to expand. It presents a very small area in comparison to the total surface area of the right atrium. And it just doesn't seem to happen that often from experimentation and from observation. But in this case, a 5 mil embolism arriving into the right atrium of a heart of a 1600 gram neonate is going to completely change that pressure dynamic. And the pressure in the right side of the heart created by the embolism is going to force some of that air into the left side of the heart. Now, the implications of that is a complete rewriting, or the necessity for the complete rewriting of the timeline for the collapsing death of baby A. Because if the air embolism passed into the left-hand side of the heart, even 25% of it, even 10% of it, it's going to have profound implications for the clinical presentation. So we imagine there is a 5 mil air embolism in the right side of the heart, and a portion of it passes into the left side of the heart through a patent foramen ovale. The first two ports of call for that air embolism will be the brain and the heart of the baby. And the effects of that air embolism in the brain and the heart of the baby would be immediate. In other words, the brain would have ceased functioning and the heart would have ceased functioning before Dr. Jayaram even got there, and there wouldn't be the continued presence of a heartbeat up until 20, 33 hours. And that is taking into account even the fact that Fick's law and Henry's law combined would still mandate the removal of the oxygen from the air embolism, even on the left-hand side of the heart. The clinical effects of the movement of the embolism from the right side to the left side would involve the persistent nitrogen component of the air embolism, which would block blood flow to the heart and blood flow to the brain. So this is the point that Dr. Lee was making when he said that venous circulation takes blood away from organs and arterial circulation delivers blood to organs. In this case, it would deliver the much more persistent nitrogen component that could literally take hours and hours to dissipate, meaning that the timeline for collapse and death of baby A would have to move significantly forward and would have to produce ECG changes, STEMI, ST elevated, myocardial infarction, and EEG changes, or the clinical signs of abnormal brain activity, which would be seizures. All of these will have to be moved forward into the timeline. The fact that there is a patent foramen ovale there means that baby A would have died instantly from the right to left shunting of even part of this air embolism. It only requires something in the region of 0.1 mil of nitrogen to block the heart arteries in the preterm baby, and a similar amount in the brain. Don't forget that 50% of that embolism is going to be carried to the brain by the arteries immediately, because there's 100 cycles per minute. That's 100 or more heartbeats per minute, which means that within 1 minute, an organ taking 50% of the output of the heart, and the second organ, the heart, taking 25% of the output of the heart, will be exposed to the blocking effects of the nitrogen. So again, it just makes the whole story completely implausible, but I argue unbelievable. And again, for anyone who wants to go through this in detail, you can go to the link that I've left to the document I've created. So this is the way we have to look at medicine. We have to look at medicine as a scientific exercise and not a storytelling exercise. Now, the patient comes into you and they tell you a story, and that's how every consultation starts. But it's the job of the scientist to break down the story and link it to what we know about physics, chemistry, biology, pathology, and all the rest of it, in order to distill from that story the start of a tapestry that's going to show us what is actually happening, if anything. And that's not what happened here. What happened here is clearly we started off with an assumption, Evans syndrome, and we worked our way back to fit the Letby story into a plausible diagnosis, which is the exact opposite of what we do in real life. Now, there are two more components that we have to look at here, and one was the claim and evidence by Dr. Bowen that these umbilical venous catheters don't move for 2 weeks after they're put in. The claim by Dr. Evans that the 4 hours without fluid didn't have any influence on the baby, both of which are rubbish. We know from experimentation and from observation that umbilical venous catheters can move within 1 hour of insertion, not within 2 weeks. And particularly when you leave it unattended, it's much more likely to move. And Evans' claim that 4 hours of fluid is not sufficient to cause a problem in the baby is incorrect as well. To begin with, we don't know if it was 4 hours. It could have been more than 4 hours. And in my opinion, it was likely more than 4 hours. But if we just go by the 4 hours and compare to what we do know, Professor Kinsey told us that at 10 p.m., 2 hours or 1 3/4 hours after birth, the hematocrit of baby A was normal for a 30-week gestation neonate. But we roll this on 20 hours of CPAP in humidified air, 25 ml output of urine minimum. We know that one measurement of urine was 25 mils. There could have been more, but we know of one. And a minimum of 4 hours without fluid. What does that tell us about the fluid deficit in this baby? So if we do a calculation of the fluid deficit, the target is 80 mils per kilogram per day, multiplied by 1.6 kilograms. That's 128 mils a day needed at a minimum, because the recommended range is 80 to 100. So we're taking it at the lowest. So the actual fluid intake is influenced by the 4 hours stoppage. So the baby received 20 hours of fluid rather than 24 hours of fluid. And if we assume that the prescribed rate was 128 mils a day, that leaves us with a 5.33 mil deficit, worked out on an hourly basis, which is a cumulative deficit of 21.3 mils over what is recommended. Now, the expected urine output would be 1 mil per kilogram per hour, multiplied by 1.6 for 24 hours, 38.4 mil. So that means we have an excess, in other words, retained fluid of 38.4 minus 25, which is 13.4 mils. So that's an advantage to the baby in terms of total body water content. Then we add nasal CPAP, and that increases insensible water loss by about 20%, which is 25.6 mils per day. Sepsis, which we know was diagnosed clinically at 10 p.m. shortly after birth, will create or likely create what are called third space losses. You have the intracellular space, the extracellular space, and the third space. The intracellular space is all of the fluid in the cell. Extracellular is all the fluid outside the cell, legitimately. And the third space is fluid that's anywhere else other than those two places. Interstitial fluid, that's fluid between organs leaking out because of inflammation, etc. It's called third spacing. And the calculation for that would be third space losses of 20 mils per kilogram per day, which in a 1.6 kilogram neonate adds up to 32 mils. So if we calculate that as a simple sum, we get 21.3 mils of an intake shortfall. We have a urine deficit of 13.4 mils, CPAP losses of 25.6 mils, sepsis losses of 32 mils, giving us a total deficit of 92 mils. Now, a total deficit of 92 mils is 5.8% of body weight within 24 hours. And we know from experimentation and knowledge that anything over a 5% deficit based on body weight will produce moderate to severe dehydration. This is going to result in at least a period of time where the hematocrit, which was probably around 45%, but could have been higher in that initial 10 p.m. blood test. And the hematocrit is the portion of the blood that is solid as opposed to liquid and determines the viscosity or thickness of the blood. We're going to see, at least because of the sepsis and the CPAP, we're going to see a hematocrit increase, likely over 55% if it had been calculated or measured during the baby's life, which it wasn't. And that is going to confound the coagulation state of the baby, which is likely what happened. Now, as the compensatory mechanisms kick in to try and compensate for the lack of fluid, because we get leak of fluid from the capillaries due to sepsis, we may see hemodilution at the end stage of the baby, but that would also imply the onset of shock, because all of these compensatory changes that will hemodilute and reduce the viscosity will imply the presence of sepsis in the baby. So either way you look at it, it is not good. So contrary to Evans' claim as part of the Evans syndrome that the baby was stable, from the fluid losses alone, the baby was not stable. And the Court of Appeal will have to accept that they made a mistake by accepting his word that that was true, because it's not true. And it breaches every care guideline written for preterm neonates, because fluid maintenance is a critical part of normal neonatal care, for the very reason that if you don't do it, you are exposing the baby to risks it need not have. No one would let the baby go even more than an hour. It's more pseudoscientific rubbish. But it's necessary to create bias against Lucy Letby by using lack of data to infer a positive finding. The honest expert would say, we do not have sufficient data to tell us what the effects of the 4 hours without fluid had on the baby. So instead, we're going to say it had no effect, because that, in effect, bolsters the case against Letby. It's junk, pseudoscience, bad medicine, and it shouldn't be allowed. And finally, we will draw this to a conclusion by saying that Dr. Jayaram, at the time of this incident, was probably 20 years older than Dr. Harkness. Dr. Jayaram also came from a pediatric room to a high-intensity lighting neonatal intensive care room within minutes. So there are at least 3 things there that could affect his ability to perceive pink, first of which is known as chromatic maladaptation. So Dr. Jayaram would have to have been present in the room for at least 20 and probably more minutes in order for his colour perception or chromatic adaptation to reach baseline. But he wasn't there that long. So the fact that he came from a differently lighted room to an intensively lighted room means that his perception of pink is automatically different from Dr. Harkness' perception of pink. Secondly, because he is much older than Dr. Harkness, he will have yellowing of the lenses, which is a normal part of aging. But the yellowing of the lenses means that colours and frequencies of light associated with colours don't penetrate the eyes as well as they do in younger people. And this means that the perception of pink is going to be different in Dr. Harkness than it is in Dr. Jayaram. A further effect on Dr. Jayaram will be the presence of adrenaline in his own system. So rather than his simplistic descriptions in the Thirlwell inquiry that adrenaline only works on the myocardium or heart muscle, it works on nearly everything in the body. And one of those things is the pupils of the eye. Now, given his age difference, his pupillary muscles are going to be weaker than Dr. Harkness's pupillary muscles, and that means that his eyes are not going to react to adjust and constrain the entrance of light into the retina in the optimum way. The adrenaline will cause the pupils to expand, which again is going to alter colour perception. But don't forget, Dr. Harkness has been in that room for an hour, so he's already chromatically or colour adjusted. So both of them are going to perceive pink as different, and indeed blue, red, and all the other colours that they mentioned. On top of that, it depends on what kind of lighting was present in the room. LED lights, in particular, can create flickering effects, particularly when moving from one room to another. But it's not just confined to LED lights, but other light sources, fluorescent lights, can produce a flickering effect so that it makes the brain think that colours are moving when they're not moving. And it's an effect of the light. It also explains why everyone else in the unit had never seen this type of rash before in their life. Because to interpret modelling or any kind of modelling uniformly across different environments, different times, different adaptation periods for the function of the eyes is going to produce de facto rashes or skin discolorations that you've never witnessed before, because not all of the circumstances of the lighting and the angles, the observation periods, all of that stuff is going to be the same for each of these discolorations that you witness. So again, science explains why these observations, most of which weren't even recorded at the time, but these observations, assuming that they're true, are different than anything that anyone would have seen before, because the environment was not the same where they made the observations. Now, in case Dr. Jayaram wants to argue, there are specific rashes that can occur due to nitrogen blockage in the peripheries, not due to hemoglobin or the effect of hemoglobin, because there's not enough of it, but due to the effect that nitrogen is blocking blood reaching the skin. But these skin conditions are very specific, and they do not tally with what he observed. And because they are created by the blockage of blood reaching target organs, they usually persist for hours, if not days, after any resuscitation attempts work in these babies. So again, we know the oxygen cannot have had any effect on the skin, and we know that if the nitrogen component of an neuroembolism had had an effect on the skin, it wouldn't be the one that Dr. Jayaram described. So the best place for the pink-flitting rash is the bin. And what these people need to do is assemble all the necessary data, which they don't have, to prove the presence of a neuroembolism, because you can infer anything you want from intentional neuroembolism syndrome, otherwise known as Evans syndrome, otherwise known as pseudoscientific junk. And for a practicing physician with an awful lot of experience of witnessing medicine, learning about medicine, I can't emphasize enough just how awful this evidence is. It's laughable, really, really laughable, and how little it was interrogated. And I understand the frustration of the defense, because when you set out to create pseudoscience, the purpose of that is that you create a situation where it's difficult, if not impossible, to falsify anything that the other side says. Because if you end up agreeing that one of these non-specific findings wasn't present, well, the other four were present. But if an expert was asked for the defense, could this modelling occur because of an neuroembolism? They would have to say, yes, it could occur because of a neuroembolism. And the immediate response from the prosecution to that is, okay, so there was a neuroembolism. If you were a dishonest witness, you would then say, no, it can't occur because of neuroembolism, in which case you would be called a liar. Your credibility as a witness or an expert would be shot to pieces. So you can see the elegance of pseudoscience as a perfect trap When you cannot honestly falsify a claim, and when you substitute imagined data or recall data or constructed data for real data, it's the perfect storm for creating a miscarriage of justice, which is what happened in this case. I think in the last 10, 20, 30 years, whatever, since the 70s anyway, when I remember reading the first serious biological experimentation that was going on that led to, for instance, the discovery of vitamin D. Things have just gone downhill in terms of actual, real, day-to-day science, in my opinion. And even though a lot of really good work is going on in the world, there's a lot of junk as well. And the Letby trial was a perfect showcase of pseudoscientific junk. So, as I say, I will leave you a link for all the reasoning behind what I say. You can read it if you want, but the general takeaway is this is not enough evidence, not near enough evidence to convict anyone of anything, let alone the very specific charges made against Lucy Letby. So I hope you got something from that. And another long podcast. I'm sorry, but there we go. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.